The blizzard that swept through Wind River Valley in December of 1923 was the kind that old-timers would talk about for decades. Snow fell so thick it seemed like the sky itself was collapsing, and the wind howled with a voice that could freeze a man's soul. Jake Morrison pulled his collar tight around his neck as he guided his horse through the drifts near Sacred Bear Mountain, searching for 3 head of cattle that had wandered from the herd. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 45, Jake had weathered plenty of Wyoming storms, but this one felt different, angrier somehow, like nature itself was settling old scores. He'd been riding for 2 hours when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind through the pines. But something made him stop, made him listen harder. There it was again, not the cry of an animal, but something human. Something that didn't belong in this frozen wilderness. Jake dismounted and followed the sound, his boots crunching through snow that reached past his knees. What he found beneath a cluster of frost-covered rocks would change everything he thought he knew about family, love, and the debts we owe to strangers. 2 small figures huddled together in a makeshift shelter of branches and pine needles, their dark hair dusted with snow, their lips blue with cold. Native children, twins by the look of them, no older than 8. The boy had wrapped his thin jacket around his sister, leaving himself exposed to the bitter wind. Their eyes dark and wide with fear met Jake's through the swirling snow, and in that instant, 3 lives became forever intertwined. Jake Morrison had spent the last 15 years building Copper Ridge Ranch into something his father would have been proud of. 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, 500 head of the finest cattle in Wyoming, and a house big enough for the family he'd never had. But success, he'd learned, could be the loneliest companion of all. His wife had died in childbirth 10 years ago, taking with her not just their unborn child, but every dream Jake had carried of voices filling his empty rooms and laughter echoing through his halls. Now, staring at these 2 children who'd somehow survived a night in conditions that could kill a grown man, Jake felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was buried forever. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around them both. The boy tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper through chattering teeth, but Jake hushed him gently. There would be time for questions later. Right now, there was only the race against cold and time. He lifted them onto his horse, one small body in front of him, the other behind, and turned toward home. The storm seemed to sense urgency in their flight, throwing ice and wind at them with renewed fury. But Jake held tight to his unexpected cargo, murmuring words of comfort in a voice he hadn't used since his wife's funeral. The ride back to Copper Ridge felt like an eternity, but when the warm glow of his windows finally appeared through the white curtain of snow, Jake allowed himself to believe that, maybe just maybe, some miracle still happened in this hard land. Martha Stevens had been keeping house for Jake Morrison since his wife passed, and in all those years she'd never seen him burst through the front door like a man possessed. She was pulling bread from the oven when he stumbled inside, snow cascading from his shoulders, carrying 2 half-frozen children like they were made of spun glass. Martha was a woman of few words but quick action. Within minutes, she had blankets warming by the fire, hot soup simmering on the stove, and a tub of warm water ready in the kitchen. The twins, for that's what they clearly were, mirror images of each other, despite their different genders, sat wrapped in quilts near the fireplace, their dark eyes tracking every movement in the room. The boy, who looked to be the older of the 2 by perhaps minutes, kept his arm protectively around his sister, even as warmth began to return to their small bodies. Jake knelt before them, his rough hands gentle as he checked for signs of frostbite. "What are your names?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the kind of patience that came from years of working with skittish animals. The boy's chin lifted slightly, and when he spoke, His words carried the careful pronunciation of someone who'd been taught English as a second language. "I am Tommy," he said, then gestured to his sister. "This is Sarah. We are Black Horse." The name meant something to Jake. The Black Horse family was well respected on the reservation 15 miles east of Pine Valley. But what were Black Horse children doing alone on Sacred Bear Mountain in the middle of a blizzard? Martha appeared with bowls of steaming broth, and Jake watched as the children's eyes widened at the sight of food. They ate slowly, carefully, like people who'd learned not to waste anything precious. Between spoonfuls, Tommy explained in halting English mixed with phrases in his native tongue that Jake didn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. Their mother had sent them to gather medicine plants for their sick grandmother. A sudden storm had separated them from their guide, an older cousin who'd promised to watch over them. They'd taken shelter and waited, but no one came. As the story unfolded, Jake felt anger building in his chest, not at the children, but at whatever circumstances had led to 2 young lives being risked for a handful of herbs. He'd heard stories about the reservation, about families struggling to survive on land that couldn't support them, about the slow starvation that killed as surely as any blizzard. But those had always been distant problems, other people's troubles. Now, looking at Tommy and Sarah's thin faces and 2 large eyes, those problems had names and voices. The storm raged for 3 more days, making travel impossible. During those hours trapped together in the warm cocoon of the ranch house, something remarkable began to happen. The children's English improved with each conversation, and Jake found himself remembering words in Shoshone that his grandfather had taught him decades ago. Tommy proved to have an insatiable curiosity about everything from the workings of the wood stove to the pictures on Jake's walls, while Sarah possessed an artist's eye, studying the patterns in Martha's quilts with the intensity of someone committing beauty to memory. On the second day, Jake discovered that Tommy could read not just simple words, but actual sentences from the books in Jake's study. The boy had been taught by missionaries on the reservation, he explained, and he'd taught Sarah everything he learned. Jake found himself pulling down volumes he hadn't touched in years, watching in amazement as Tommy sounded out unfamiliar words with the determination of someone who understood that knowledge was a form of freedom. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah, meanwhile, had found Jake's late wife's sewing basket. With Martha's permission, she began creating intricate patterns with scraps of fabric, her small fingers working with a skill that seemed impossible for someone so young. When Jake asked where she'd learned such techniques, she simply smiled and said her grandmother had shown her. "She says the patterns tell stories," Sarah explained. "This one tells about the snow that brought us to you." By the 3rd day, the children had claimed spaces in the house that Jake hadn't realized were empty. Tommy's boots sat beside Jake's by the kitchen door. Sarah's makeshift doll, crafted from corn husks and fabric scraps, had taken up residence on the mantelpiece. At meals, conversation flowed between English and Shoshone, with Martha learning words for thank you and more bread please, while the twins discovered the names for things they'd never seen: crystal glasses, books with golden spines, a grandfather clock that chimed the hours. But it wasn't just language they were sharing. Jake found himself telling stories he'd never spoken aloud, about his father building this ranch for nothing, about the wife who'd made him believe in tomorrow, about the loneliness that had settled into his bones like winter cold. The children listened with the grave attention of people who understood loss, and when Tommy reached over to pat Jake's hand during a particularly difficult memory, the gesture carried more comfort than any words could have provided. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke. Sunshine streamed through windows that had shown nothing but white for days, and the world outside sparkled like it had been crafted from diamonds. Jake knew what this meant. The roads would be passable soon, and he'd need to return the children to their family. The thought sat in his stomach like a stone. He found Sheriff Bob Clark that afternoon, when the man rode up to check on storm damage. Bob was a practical man who'd known Jake since they were boys, and he listened without interruption as Jake explained about finding the twins. When Jake finished, Bob was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered pastures. "Jake," Bob said finally, "I hate to be the one to tell you this, but there's been talk on the reservation. Elena Blackhorse has been missing for over a week. Some folks think she went looking for those children herself and got caught in the same storm." He paused, his weathered face grim. "Her mother, the children's grandmother, she's been sick for months. There's no other family to speak of." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He thought of Tommy's fierce protectiveness of his sister, of Sarah's quiet strength, of the way they'd both spoken of their mother with the kind of love that made ordinary words sound like prayers. The idea that Elena Blackhorse might be lying somewhere in the snow, that she'd died trying to find her children, made Jake's chest tight with grief for people he'd never met. What happens to them? Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. Bob's expression softened. "Well, if no family comes forward, they'll likely end up at the Indian school in Colorado. Government's got programs for situations like this." The way he said it made clear that programs wasn't a word that inspired confidence. That night, Jake sat by the fire long after Martha had gone to bed and the children were asleep upstairs in the guest room. He thought about the sounds that had filled his house for the past 4 days, laughter at breakfast, the rustle of pages turning as Tommy read aloud to his sister, the soft humming Sarah made while she worked on her fabric patterns. He thought about going back to eating meals in silence, about rattling around in rooms that would feel even emptier now that he'd remembered what fullness sounded like. More than that, he thought about Tommy and Sarah being separated from everything they'd ever known, sent to a place where their language would be forbidden and their culture would be something to be erased rather than celebrated. The injustice of it burned in his throat like swallowed smoke. Jake Morrison had built his life on practical decisions, on careful planning and measured risks. But sitting there in the flickering firelight, with the phantom sound of children's voices still echoing in his memory, he realized that some decisions couldn't be made with the head alone. Some choices required a leap of faith that defied every logical argument. When Tommy appeared at the top of the stairs the next morning, his dark hair tousled from sleep and his eyes still heavy with dreams, Jake was waiting with a question that would change all their lives forever. "How would you and Sarah feel about staying here?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Not just until we find your family, but for as long as you want." "As my children." Tommy's eyes widened, and for a moment, Jake feared he'd overstepped, presumed too much. But then Sarah appeared beside her brother, and the twins exchanged one of those wordless conversations that only siblings could have. When Tommy looked back at Jake, tears were streaming down his cheeks. "You would want us?" Tommy whispered. "Even though we are different?" Jake knelt down so he was at eye level with both children. "Tommy, Sarah, the only thing different about you is that you've made my house feel like a home again. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to be your father." Sarah launched herself into Jake's arms with the pure trust that only children possessed. And when Tommy followed a heartbeat later, Jake felt something break open in his chest, not with pain, but with a joy so fierce it took his breath away. Martha appeared in the doorway, tears on her lying cheeks and a smile that could have powered the entire valley. And Jake knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. The legal arrangements would take months to sort through, involving lawyers and government officials and more paperwork than Jake had ever seen in his life. But in the quiet of that December morning, with snow sparkling outside the windows and 2 children in his arms, who'd somehow found their way home through a blizzard, Jake Morrison understood that the most important adoptions happened not in courtrooms, but in hearts that finally learned how to be whole. Word traveled fast in Pine Valley, as it always did in small towns where everyone's business became everyone else's concern before the sun set. By the time Jake hitched up his wagon to take the twins into town for supplies, half the population already knew about the Black Horse children living at Copper Ridge Ranch. What they didn't know was what to make of it. Annie Cooper, the schoolteacher, was hanging laundry when she spotted Jake's wagon rolling down Main Street with Tommy and Sarah perched beside him like they belonged there. The sight stopped her cold, not because it was unusual to see Jake with passengers, but because of the easy way the children sat with him, Sarah's hand resting on his arm while Tommy pointed out landmarks with the enthusiasm of someone giving a tour of his own neighborhood. Old Pete Whitman emerged from his general store, wiping flour-dusted hands on his apron, his weathered face creasing into lines of curiosity. Pete had run that store for 30 years and prided himself on knowing every soul within 50 miles, but these children were strangers to him. When Jake climbed down from the wagon and helped the twins to the ground with the careful attention of a father, Pete's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "Morning, Jake," Pete called out, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man fishing for information. "Mighty fine day for a trip to town." Jake nodded, one hand resting protectively on Tommy's shoulder. "Pete, I'd like you to meet Tommy and Sarah. They'll be living at the ranch now." The words were simple, spoken with the quiet authority of a man who'd made his decision and wasn't looking for approval. But in a town where the nearest reservation existed as a separate world that rarely intersected with daily life, simple words could carry complicated implications. Sarah had discovered the candy display in Pete's front window, her dark eyes wide with wonder at the array of peppermint sticks and licorice wheels. She whispered something to Tommy in Shoshone, and he translated, with the seriousness of someone handling important diplomatic negotiations. "She wants to know if the red and white sticks taste like the winter berries from home," Tommy explained to Jake. "But she says she understands if they cost too much." Pete's expression softened despite himself. He'd seen plenty of children covet his candy display over the years, but none had ever shown such polite restraint. "Well now," he said, bending down to Sarah's level, "seems to me a young lady ought to try one before she decides if it's worth buying." He selected a peppermint stick and handed it to her with the ceremony usually reserved for much grander gifts. Sarah's face lit up like sunrise over the mountains, and when she carefully broke the candy in half to share with her brother, Pete felt something shift in his chest. He'd heard plenty of talk about reservation Indians over the years, most of it carrying the weight of assumptions and prejudices that people pass down like family recipes. But watching these children share a simple piece of candy with the grace of tiny diplomats made those old stories seem hollow and mean-spirited. The morning passed in a series of small encounters that would shape how Pine Valley came to view the newest members of the Morrison family. At the post office, Sarah helped Mrs. Jenkins sort mail by color when the elderly woman's arthritis made handling the letters difficult. At the bank, Tommy impressed Mr. Fletcher by counting out exact change for Jake's transactions, his mathematical skills sharp enough to make the banker nod with professional approval. But it was at the church that the most significant meeting took place. Pastor John Mills was repairing a loose board on the front steps when Jake's wagon pulled up. Pastor Mills was a man who measured his words carefully, understanding that, in a town like Pine Valley, a minister's opinions carried weight beyond the pulpit. He'd baptized Jake's wife, conducted her funeral service, and watched his friend struggle through the long years of loneliness that followed. "Jake," Pastor Mills said, setting down his hammer and brushing sawdust from his hands, "heard you've had some house guests." Jake helped the twins down from the wagon, his movements careful and deliberate. "More than guests, Pastor. Tommy and Sarah are family now." Pastor Mills studied the children with the same attention he gave to his Sunday sermons, looking for truth beneath surface appearances. Tommy met his gaze directly, his young face serious but unafraid, while Sarah stayed close to her brother, but offered a shy smile when the pastor nodded to her. "Family," Pastor Mills repeated, testing the word like he was examining its weight. "That's a considerable blessing, Jake. Children change a house in ways a man doesn't always expect." "Yes, sir," Jake replied. "They surely do." What Pastor Mills saw in Jake's face was something he'd been praying to witness for years: the return of purpose, of joy, of the spark that had died when Jake buried his wife and unborn child. The man standing before him wasn't the hollow-eyed widower who'd been going through the motions of living. This was someone who'd remembered what it meant to have something precious to protect. "Well then," Pastor Mills said, extending his hand to Tommy, "any family of Jake Morrison's is welcome in this church. I hope we'll see you all Sunday morning." Tommy shook the pastor's hand with the solemnity of someone sealing an important agreement. "We would like that very much, sir. Sarah and I have many questions about your ways of worship." Pastor Mills smiled, genuinely delighted by the boy's directness. "Questions are always welcome in God's house, son. That's how we all learn to understand each other better." The ride back to Copper Ridge was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of people who'd successfully navigated unfamiliar territory. Sarah had fallen asleep against Jake's shoulder, her new peppermint stick carefully wrapped in her handkerchief for safekeeping. Tommy sat on Jake's other side, watching the landscape roll past with the attention of someone memorizing every detail. "The people in town," Tommy said eventually, "they look at us like we are puzzles they cannot solve." Jake considered this observation, impressed by the boy's perceptiveness. "Some folks aren't used to seeing families that look different from their own," he said carefully. "But I noticed something today. By the time we left each place, they weren't looking at you like strangers anymore. They were looking at you like children." Tommy nodded slowly. "In our old life, people sometimes looked at us like we were problems, to be fixed. Here, they look at us like we are just us." "That's because you are just you," Jake replied. "And that's exactly who I want you to be." That evening, Martha served a dinner that had become their new tradition: roast chicken with vegetables from the root cellar, fresh bread that Sarah had helped knead, and conversation that flowed between English and Shoshone like a stream finding its natural course. Jake had started learning basic phrases in the children's native language, his pronunciation terrible but his effort sincere enough to make Tommy giggle and Sarah clap with delight when he managed to ask for salt without accidentally requesting a horse instead. After dinner, Tommy produced a letter he'd been working on all week, written in his careful handwriting with help from Sarah's artistic touches around the margins. It was addressed to their grandmother, if she could be found, explaining where they were and that they were safe and loved. Jake read it over, marveling at the boy's ability to convey complex emotions in his second language, and promised to make sure it reached the reservation. As the twins prepared for bed, Jake found himself standing in the doorway of what had once been his guest room and was now simply the children's room. Tommy had arranged his few possessions on one side of the dresser, while Sarah had claimed the windowsill for her growing collection of interesting rocks and pressed flowers. Their belongings were few, but they'd made the space entirely their own with the confidence of children who finally felt secure enough to put down roots. Sarah called out softly from her bed, "Jake, father, will you tell us a story?" The title she'd given him still caught him off guard every time he heard it, filling his chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire downstairs. "What kind of story would you like? Tell us about the ranch," Tommy requested. "About how your father built it from nothing. Sarah wants to understand how dreams become real places." So Jake settled into the chair between their beds and began to speak about a young man who'd come west with nothing but determination and a belief that hard work could transform empty land into something lasting. As he talked, he realized he was telling them about more than just the ranch's history. He was explaining how families could be built the same way, with patience and faith and the willingness to believe that love could create something permanent out of what seemed like nothing at all. The children fell asleep to the sound of his voice, weaving stories about foundation stones and fence posts, about cattle drives and harvest celebrations, about the woman who'd made his father's dreams feel complete and the children who'd made his own dreams feel possible again. And when Jake finally closed their door and made his way to his own room, he carried with him the knowledge that some gifts came disguised as blizzards, and that the best families weren't always the ones you were born into, but the ones you chose to create with an open heart and unwavering faith in the power of love to bridge any distance. Part 3. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in January, carried by a rider from the Indian Agency, whose horse steamed in the cold air as he approached Copper Ridge Ranch. Jake accepted the official envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Not from cold, but from the weight of possibilities it contained. Tommy and Sarah were at the kitchen table working on their lessons with Martha, their voices carrying the comfortable rhythm of children who'd found their place in the world. Inside the envelope was news that Jake had both hoped for and dreaded. Elena Blackhorse had been found. She was alive, recovering at the agency hospital after being discovered by a search party, nearly frozen to death in a canyon 10 miles from where Jake had found the twins. The letter explained that she'd spent 2 weeks searching for her children before collapsing from exhaustion and exposure. Now, after a month of medical care, she was demanding to see Tommy and Sarah. Jake read the letter 3 times before the words fully settled in his mind. The woman who'd given birth to the children sleeping under his roof, who'd raised them with love and sacrifice, who'd nearly died trying to find them, was waiting to reclaim them. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone, cold and heavy. With the weight of impending loss, Martha noticed his expression first, her sharp eyes reading the change in his face like weather signs. "What is it?" she asked quietly, glancing toward the children to make sure they were still absorbed in their arithmetic. "Their mother," Jake said simply. "She's alive. She wants them back." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that stretched far beyond their simple meaning. Martha's hands stilled on the dish rag she'd been twisting, and for a long moment, the only sounds in the kitchen were Tommy's careful counting and Sarah's pencil scratching against her slate. Jake excused himself and walked out to the barn, needing space to think without the children witnessing his struggle. The morning was bright, but bitter, the kind of cold that made every breath visible and turned the world into something crystalline and sharp. He stood among the cattle, these animals he'd raised from calves, and tried to imagine his life returning to the silence that had defined it before 2 small voices had taught him what his house was supposed to sound like, but beneath his own. Grief was something more important, the knowledge that Tommy and Sarah deserved to know their mother was alive, that she'd risked everything to find them, that she loved them enough to brave storms and wilderness and the possibility of death. Whatever Jake's feelings about losing them, the children had a right to make their own choices about where they belonged. When he returned to the house, Tommy looked up from his lesson with the intuitive awareness that had made him such a protective brother. "Something has changed," the boy observed. "You have worry lines around your eyes." Jake sat down at the table, placing the letter carefully in front of him. "I received news today. Good news, but complicated news. Your mother has been found. She's alive, and she's been looking for you." The reaction was immediate and complex. Sarah's face lit up with pure joy, her small hands clasping together as she whispered what Jake had learned was a prayer of thanksgiving in Shoshone. Tommy's response was more guarded, happiness warring, with confusion as he looked between Jake and the letter. "She is well?" Tommy asked. "She was not hurt in the snow?" "She was hurt," Jake said honestly, "but she's getting better. The letter says she wants to see you both as soon as possible." Sarah bounced in her chair, excitement making her words tumble over each other in a mixture of languages. "We can. Tell her about the ranch and Martha's bread and the books and the candy from Mr. Pete, and how you taught me to whistle and she stopped suddenly, her joy dimming as a thought occurred to her. Will we have to leave? It was the question Jake had been dreading, the one that cut straight to the heart of everything they'd built together. That's something we'll need to discuss with your mother, he said carefully. She loves you very much, and she's been searching for you all this time. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. Tommy studied Jake's face with the sharp intelligence that never failed to surprise adults who underestimated him. You are sad about this news, he observed, even though it is good news. Jake considered lying, offering some adult platitude about being happy for them while hiding his own feelings. But these children had faced harder truths than most adults ever would, and they deserved honesty. I am happy that your mother is safe, he said. And I'm sad because I love you both so much that the thought of losing you feels like losing pieces of my heart. Sarah climbed down from her chair and wrapped her arms around Jake's neck, her small body warm and solid against his chest. You could not lose us, she said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. We are family now. Families don't disappear just because geography changes. Tommy nodded gravely. Sarah is right. You have been our father in the snow. Time. That does not stop being true just because our birth mother returns. Their faith in the permanence of love both comforted and terrified Jake. He'd learned that families could be torn apart by forces beyond their control, that love sometimes wasn't enough to overcome distance and law and the claims of blood. But looking at these two children, who'd already survived more upheaval than anyone should have to bear, he chose to believe in their version of truth rather than his own fears. The journey to the Indian Agency took most of a day, the wagon wheels crunching through snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds under the winter sun. Tommy and Sarah sat close together, their excitement tinged with nervousness as they approached. A reunion they'd dreamed about, but never quite believed would happen. Jake kept his hands steady on the reins while his mind raced through possibilities, scenarios, conversations that might determine the shape of all their futures. The agency buildings were squat and functional, built for efficiency rather than comfort, their brown walls stark against the white landscape. Inside the hospital ward, a nurse led them through corridors that smelled of carbolic acid and institutional cooking, past rooms where other patients lay recovering from the various ailments that winter brought to people living on the margins of survival. Elena Blackhorse was sitting up in bed when they entered her room, and Jake felt his breath catch at his first sight of the woman who'd given birth to Tommy and Sarah. She was younger than he'd expected, probably no more than 30, with the kind of delicate bone structure that her children had inherited and eyes that held depths of experience far beyond her years. When she saw the twins, her face transformed with a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. Tommy, Sarah. Her voice broke on their names, and suddenly the children were running to her bedside, Sarah launching herself into her mother's arms, while Tommy pressed close to her side, all of them speaking in rapid Shoshone through tears that had been waiting months to fall. Jake stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in this sacred moment of reunion. He understood enough of their language now to catch fragments of their conversation. Sarah telling her mother about the ranch and the candy and the books. Tommy explaining about school and lessons and learning to read better. Elena asking if they'd been warm and safe and loved. When Elena finally looked up at Jake, her eyes held a mixture of gratitude and wariness that he recognized from his own experiences with trust. You are the man who found them, she said, her English careful but clear. The one who kept them safe. Yes, ma'am, Jake replied. They've been a blessing to my household. Elena studied his face with the same direct intelligence he'd learned to expect from her children. They speak of you as their Jake father. This is a title of great honor in their hearts. Jake felt his throat tighten. The honor has been mine, Mrs. Blackhorse. They've brought light to a house that had forgotten what family sounded like. For a long moment, The room was quiet except for Sarah's soft humming as she showed her mother a fabric pattern she'd been working on. Elena looked at her children, really looked at them, taking in their healthy color, their clean clothes, the confidence in their postures that spoke of security and love. When she met Jake's eyes again, there was something new in her expression. "I need to understand," she said slowly, "what kind of life they have had with you, what kind of man you are. Because these are not the same children I sent to gather medicine plants. These are children who have grown in ways that only happen when they feel truly safe." Jake nodded, understanding that he was being evaluated, measured against standards that mattered more than wealth or status. They've attended school, learned to read and write better, helped with ranch work appropriate for their age. They've been raised with respect for both their heritage and the community they're living in. Most importantly, they've been loved without condition or expectation of anything in return. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. "This is what every mother dreams of for her children," she whispered. To know they were cherished when she could not be there to cherish them herself. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself in conversations he'd never imagined having. Discussions about culture and language and the complex realities of raising Native children in a white community. Elena spoke honestly about the struggles of reservation life, about families torn apart by poverty and disease and policies designed to destroy traditional ways of living. She also spoke about her own dreams for Tommy and Sarah, hopes that extended far beyond mere survival to encompass education and opportunity and the chance to navigate between two worlds with pride in both. By evening, when visiting hours ended and they had to return to Pine Valley, Jake understood that the next few days would bring decisions that would reshape all their lives. Elena Blackhorse was not the broken woman he'd imagined, but a strong, loving mother who wanted what was best for her children above all else. The question was whether what was best for Tommy and Sarah could somehow include all the people who loved them, or whether love would require sacrifice that none of them were quite prepared to make. Part 4. The negotiations that followed. Elena's recovery took place in locations that seemed too small to contain the weight of decisions being made. The Indian Agency office, with its scarred wooden desk and filing cabinets full of broken promises. Pastor Mill's study, where afternoon light slanted through windows that had witnessed countless confessions and consultations. The kitchen at Copper Ridge Ranch, where Martha served coffee and Elena studied the place her children had learned to call home. Elena Blackhorse proved to be a woman of careful intelligence, someone who measured each word before speaking and considered implications that stretched far beyond immediate concerns. She spent hours with Tommy and Sarah, listening to their stories about ranch life and town school, and the way Jake had taught them to see themselves as bridges between worlds rather than people caught between them. "He reads to us every night," Sarah explained to her mother in Shoshone, her small hands gesturing as she spoke. "Stories about brave people who build new lives in hard places. He says we are like the heroes in those stories." Elena translated this for Jake's benefit, her voice carrying nuances that simple words couldn't convey. "She says you have given them something I could not, the belief that they can be proud of who they are while still belonging in places that don't look like them." Jake studied Elena's face, looking for signs of resentment or anger at this implicit criticism of reservation life. Instead, he found something that looked like relief. "Mrs. Blackhorse," he said carefully, "I've never tried to replace their heritage or make them forget where they came from. If anything, I've tried to learn about their culture so I could help them understand both parts of themselves." Elena nodded slowly. "I can see this. They speak Shoshone as fluently as ever, but now they also speak English like children who expect to be heard. This is a gift I could not give them alone." The conversations continued over several days with Elena, visiting the ranch to observe the daily rhythms of her children's new life. She watched Tommy help Frank Wheeler mend fences, his small hands competent with tools, and his questions showing deep curiosity about how things worked. She saw Sarah teaching Martha traditional beadwork patterns while learning to bake bread that would have made any pioneer wife proud. Most importantly, she witnessed the easy affection between Jake and the children, the way they turned to him for comfort and guidance without fear or hesitation. On the third evening of Elena's visits, she found Jake standing on the porch after. The children had gone to bed, his breath visible in the cold air as he watched stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. She joined him in comfortable silence, wrapped in one of Martha's heavy shawls, before speaking the words that had been building in her mind since the moment she'd seen her children again. "You love them," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Jake replied simply. "More than I knew it was possible to love anything." Elena nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "And they love you. Not as a rescuer or a temporary guardian, but as a father who has earned the title through daily care and attention." Jake turned to look at her, trying to read the expression on her face in the pale starlight. "Mrs. Blackhorse, I want you to know that I would never try to take them from you. You're their mother, and that's a bond I respect completely. But I also can't pretend that the thought of losing them doesn't terrify me." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the light from the kitchen windows. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of a decision that had been forming since the moment she'd seen her children's faces in the hospital room. "Jake Morrison," she said, using his full name with the formality of someone making an important pronouncement, "I have a proposition for you. Something that might seem impossible, but which I believe could work if we are both brave enough to try it." Jake felt his heart begin to race, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm listening." Elena turned to face him fully, her expression serious but not unkind. "The reservation is no place for children who have learned to dream beyond survival. The school there teaches them to be ashamed of their heritage while preparing them for nothing better than poverty. I have seen what Tommy and Sarah have become in your care, and I will not take them backward into a life that offers them no future." Jake felt hope begin to bloom in his chest, but he was afraid to trust it. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Elena said slowly, "that we find a way to share them. You have given them a foundation for success in the white world, and you have done it without stealing their pride in being Shoshone. But they still need their mother, and I still need my children. Perhaps there is a way for all of us to be family together." The idea was so unexpected, so perfectly impossible and perfectly logical at the same time, that Jake found himself speechless. Elena continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I could work as a teacher, helping other children on the reservation learn English and mathematics the way Tommy and Sarah have learned. The agency is always looking for people who can bridge the language gap. It would mean traveling back and forth between here and there, spending time in both places, creating a life that honors both worlds." Jake stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You would be willing to do that? To share custody, essentially? To let them continue living here part of the time?" Elena smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, Jake saw where Sarah had inherited her particular brand of gentle radiance. "Mr. Morrison, you saved my children's lives. But more than that, you gave them a future I could never have provided alone. The question is not whether I would be willing to share them. The question is whether you would be willing to share them with me." Jake felt tears sting his eyes, tears of relief and gratitude and the kind of overwhelming joy that comes when impossible problems find unexpected solutions. "Mrs. Blackhorse, there's nothing I would rather do than raise those children with their mother as a partner rather than an adversary." Elena extended her hand, and when Jake shook it, he felt like they were sealing more than just an agreement. They were creating a new kind of family, one that defied conventional categories, but honored the deep truth that love could take many forms and still be absolutely real. There will be challenges, Elena warned. People who don't understand. Legal complications. The simple logistics of managing a life split between two worlds. But if we are committed to what is best for Tommy and Sarah, I believe we can make it work. Jake nodded, his mind already racing through possibilities and practical considerations. We'll figure it out as we go, he said. The important thing is that they'll have both their parents, both their cultures, and the chance to choose their own path between them. As they stood together on the porch, looking out at the land that had brought them all together through the simple accident of a blizzard and two lost children, Jake felt something settle in his chest that he'd been missing for longer than he'd realized. It wasn't just the knowledge that he wouldn't lose Tommy and Sarah. It was the understanding that family could be created in ways that had nothing to do with blood or law or conventional expectations, and that the best families were often the ones that required the most courage to build. Inside the house, Martha was banking the fire for the night, and upstairs, two children slept the deep sleep of people who had learned that they were loved beyond question. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new plans, new challenges to navigate. But tonight, for the first time since Jake Morrison had found two half-frozen children in a snowstorm, the future felt not just possible, but bright with promise. Part 5 spring came early to Wind River Valley that year, as if the land itself was eager to celebrate new beginnings. By April, the snow had melted from all but the highest peaks, and the pastures around Copper Ridge Ranch were beginning to show the first tender shoots of new grass. The cottonwoods along the creek were budding, and somewhere in the distance, meadowlarks were calling to each other across the warming air. Elena had been traveling between the ranch and the reservation for 2 months now, establishing a rhythm that felt strange at first, but gradually became as natural as breathing. 3 days a week at the agency school, where she taught English and arithmetic to children who had never imagined they could master the language of the dominant culture without losing their own identity. 4 days a week at Copper Ridge, where she helped Martha with household tasks, while observing her children's integration into a community that had learned to see them not as curiosities, but as neighbors. The arrangement had required more legal paperwork than Jake had ever imagined possible, involving lawyers and Indian agency officials and lengthy consultations about guardianship rights and educational responsibilities. But Pastor Mills had proved surprisingly helpful in navigating the bureaucratic maze, using his influence with territorial officials and his deep understanding of human nature to smooth over complications that could have derailed the entire plan. Tommy and Sarah had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that had carried them through every other change in their young lives. They attended school in Pine Valley 4 days a week, where Annie Cooper had proved to be exactly the kind of teacher they needed, firm but encouraging, willing to challenge them academically while protecting them from the occasional ignorant comment from classmates who had never learned that different didn't mean inferior. On the days when Elena worked at the reservation school, the children would accompany her, helping with younger students and reconnecting with extended family members who had feared them lost forever. Jake had worried about these transitions at first, concerned that constantly moving between worlds might confuse or unsettle them. Instead, he discovered that Tommy and Sarah thrived on the variety, bringing stories from each environment to enrich their understanding of the other. "Today we taught the little ones to count in English," Sarah reported one evening, her face bright with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered the joy of sharing knowledge. "But we also learned 3 new stories from Grandmother Elk Woman about why the eagles chose to live in the high places." Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "And I helped Mr. Thompson fix the water pump at the agency, but I used the techniques Frank Wheeler taught me about leverage and mechanical advantage. Both ways of learning made the job easier." Jake listened to these reports with wonder at how naturally the children had learned to navigate between cultures, taking the best from each world while feeling fully at home in both. Elena had been right when she'd suggested that they could be bridges rather than refugees, ambassadors rather than exiles. The real test of their unconventional family structure came in late May, when the entire community of Pine Valley was invited to witness something unprecedented, a wedding that would be conducted according to both Shoshone and Christian traditions, uniting not just two people, but two ways of understanding the sacred bonds that held families together. Jake had proposed to Elena on a warm evening in April, not with romantic fanfare, but with the quiet sincerity of someone offering partnership rather than passion. They had been sitting on the porch after dinner, watching Tommy teach Sarah to kofa. Throw a lasso while Martha called out corrections from the kitchen doorway, when Elena suddenly turned to him with a question that had been building for weeks. "Jake," she said, "we have created something good here, something that works for all of us. But it exists in a legal gray area that could be challenged if the wrong people decided to make trouble. Have you thought about what it would mean if we made this arrangement more permanent?" Jake had thought about it, actually, more than he'd been willing to admit even to himself. Not because he'd fallen in love with Elena in the conventional sense, though he'd grown to admire and respect her, more than any woman he'd ever known, but because he'd come to understand that some marriages were built on passion while others were built on shared purpose, and that both could create lasting happiness if the foundation was solid enough. "Are you asking me to marry you, Elena Blackhorse?" He'd said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "I am asking you to consider whether we might be stronger together than we are apart," she'd replied. "Whether Tommy and Sarah might benefit from having parents who are legally as well as emotionally committed to their welfare." The proposal that followed was more negotiation than romance. Two practical people discussing the terms of a partnership that would benefit everyone involved. But when Jake had taken Elena's hand and asked her to become his wife, there had been nothing practical about the way her face had lit up with joy, or the way their children had whooped with delight when they'd shared the news, or the way Martha had wiped away tears while declaring that it was about time everyone in the house had the same last name. The wedding ceremony itself was a testament to the community that had grown up around their unusual family. Pastor Mills performed the Christian service, his words carefully chosen to honor the spiritual traditions of both cultures. Elena's uncle, a respected elder from the reservation, conducted the Shoshone ritual that bound their lives together according to traditions older than written law. Tommy and Sarah served as witnesses, their faces solemn with the importance of their role in creating this new chapter of their family story. Old Pete Whitman had donated flowers from his wife's carefully tended garden, while Annie Cooper had organized the church ladies to prepare a feast that combined traditional pioneer dishes with foods that Elena had taught them to prepare according to recipes passed down through generations of Shoshone women. Sheriff Bob Clark stood with tears in his eyes as he watched his lifelong friend make vows to a woman who had taught him that courage came in many forms, including the willingness to love again after believing that such happiness was impossible. But perhaps the most significant moment came after the formal ceremonies had ended, when Jake and Elena stood together in the churchyard, surrounded by everyone who had helped make their unlikely family possible. Tommy stepped forward with the gravity of someone making an important announcement, Sarah beside him with her hand resting supportively on his arm. "We have something to say," Tommy announced, his young voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "Sarah and I have talked about this, and we want everyone to know that we understand what has happened here. We are not just children who were rescued from a snowstorm. We are not just Indian children who were lucky enough to find a white family to take us in. We are Blackhorse Morrisons, and we belong to everyone who loves us." Sarah nodded seriously. "We belong to our birth mother who carried us and raised us with stories and traditions that will always be part of who we are. We belong to our chosen Father who saved our lives and taught us to dream bigger than survival. We belong to Martha who feeds us and scolds us and loves us like we were born in her own kitchen. We belong to all of you who welcomed us when we were strangers and made us part of your community." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion as he listened to these children articulate truths that most adults never learned. Elena's hand found his, and when he squeezed her fingers, he felt the solid certainty of someone who had finally found his place in the world. "Most of all," Tommy continued, his dark eyes shining with unshed tears, "we belong to each other. We are a family that was built by choice instead of chance, by love instead of law, by faith instead of fear. And nothing will ever change that. No matter what challenges come or how far apart we might travel, or how much we continue to grow and change." As the sun set over Wind River Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that would have made Sarah reach for her paints if she'd had them, Jake Morrison looked around at the people who had become his extended family. Elena beside him, beautiful and strong and committed to building something lasting together. Tommy and Sarah, no longer the half-frozen children he'd found in a blizzard, but confident young people who carried their heritage proudly while embracing their future. Fearlessly. Martha, whose gruff exterior had always hidden a heart big enough to love everyone who needed loving. The townspeople who had opened their minds and hearts to accept that families could take many forms and still be absolutely real. 6 months ago, Jake had been a successful rancher with an empty house and a lonely heart. Tonight, he was the patriarch of a family that defied every convention he'd ever known about how love was supposed to work, and he had never been happier in his life. Sometimes he reflected as he watched Tommy and Sarah chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The most unexpected gifts came wrapped in blizzards, and the best families were the ones that required the most courage to create. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered by a government courier whose official bearing suggested news that would disturb the careful peace the Morrison Black Horse family had built over the summer months. Jake accepted the envelope with reluctance, recognizing the seal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the particular weight that official correspondence always carried in territories where federal policy could reshape lives without warning or appeal. Elena was helping Sarah prepare for the school day when Jake entered the kitchen, the unopened letter in his hands like a piece of unexploded ordnance. Tommy looked up from his breakfast, his sharp eyes immediately noting the change in Jake's expression and the formal nature of the document that had arrived with the dawn. "What kind of letter comes with so much seriousness attached to it?" Tommy asked, his English now carrying the sophisticated vocabulary of a child who read everything he could get his hands on and remembered every word. Jake sat heavily at the kitchen table, turning the envelope over in his hands, as if he could divine its contents without breaking the official seal. "Sometimes the government sends letters to remind people of rules they'd rather forget about," he said carefully. "This appears to be one of those times." Elena dried her hands on her apron and moved to stand behind Jake's chair, her presence offering the kind of silent support that had become the foundation of their partnership. When Jake finally opened the letter, the words it contained were exactly as devastating as he'd feared, though couched in the bloodless language of bureaucratic efficiency. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had received reports of Native American children being raised outside official supervision in violation of federal policies regarding the education and cultural assimilation of indigenous youth. An inspector would be arriving within the month to evaluate the situation and determine whether Tommy and Sarah Blackhorse were receiving appropriate instruction in American values and whether their current living arrangement was in compliance with established guidelines for the welfare of Indian children. Elena read over Jake's shoulder, her intake of breath sharp enough to make both children look up from their morning routines. The letter went on to explain that recent legislation had strengthened the government's authority to place Native children in institutions designed to kill the Indian and save the man, a phrase that made Elena's hands tremble with suppressed anger. "What does this mean for us?" Sarah asked, her young voice carrying the kind of practiced calm that children developed when they'd learned that adult anxiety often preceded significant changes in their circumstances. Jake folded the letter carefully, as if treating it gently might somehow diminish its power to disrupt their lives. It means we're going to have a visitor who wants to make sure you're both receiving the kind of education the government thinks you should have, he said, choosing his words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. Tommy's expression darkened with understanding that went beyond his years. They want to see if we are becoming too much like white children, or if we are staying too much like Shoshone children. They want us to be something that is neither, something that serves their idea of what we should become. Elena placed her hands on both children's shoulders, her touch conveying protection and determination in equal measure. "We have done nothing wrong," she said firmly. "You are both learning English and mathematics and all the subjects that will help you succeed in any world you choose. You are also learning your own language and traditions, and the stories that connect you to your ancestors. This is exactly what education should be." Jake stood and moved to the window, looking out at the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that their quiet world was about to be invaded by forces beyond their control. "The inspector will want to see your schoolwork, observe your daily routine, and evaluate whether you're being raised according to government standards. We need to be prepared for questions that might feel more like accusations." The weeks that followed were filled with a tension that permeated every aspect of daily life at Copper Ridge Ranch. Elena worked with the children to organize their schoolwork into neat portfolios that would demonstrate their academic progress, while Jake consulted with Pastor Mills and Annie Cooper about the best ways to present their educational approach to someone who might be predisposed to find fault with anything that deviated from institutional norms. Martha, whose usually unflappable demeanor had been replaced by a simmering indignation at the idea that anyone would question the welfare of children she'd helped raise, threw herself into preparations with the fervor of someone preparing for siege warfare. The house was cleaned until it sparkled, lesson plans were arranged in perfect order, and every aspect of the children's routine was documented with the thoroughness of a military operation. Tommy and Sarah, meanwhile, had begun to exhibit the kind of careful behavior that children adopted when they sensed that adult disapproval might have consequences beyond the usual household discipline. They spoke more quietly, moved with greater deliberation, and seemed to be constantly evaluating whether their actions might be judged as evidence of inadequate supervision or cultural confusion. The inspector arrived on a gray October morning, his black carriage kicking up dust as it approached the ranch house with the inevitability of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Agent Harrison Blackwood was a thin man with pale eyes and the kind of rigid posture that suggested military training, though he wore civilian clothes that had been carefully chosen to project authority without obvious intimidation. Jake met him at the front door with the courtesy due to any guest, though every instinct he possessed warned him that this visitor had not come with benevolent intentions. Agent Blackwood accepted the offer of coffee with the air of someone performing a ritual rather than seeking refreshment, his sharp gaze already cataloging details about the house's furnishings and the family photographs displayed on the mantelpiece. "Mr. Morrison," Agent Blackwood began, settling into his chair with the careful precision of someone accustomed to conducting interviews that determined other people's fates, "I trust you understand the purpose of my visit." Jake nodded, his own posture carefully neutral despite the anger building in his chest. "You're here to evaluate the children's welfare and education. I welcome the opportunity to show you how well they're doing." Agent Blackwood opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a stack of forms that rustled with official importance. "The Bureau has received reports suggesting that these children are being raised in a manner that may not serve their best interests, or the interests of proper assimilation into American society. I'm here to determine whether intervention is necessary." Elena entered the room carrying a tray of fresh coffee, and the kind of pastries that Martha made when she wanted to demonstrate the superiority of home cooking over any institutional alternative. Agent Blackwood's eyes followed her movements with the particular attention that white men often paid to native women, as if her presence confirmed suspicions he'd brought with him rather than challenging them. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, his tone carrying just enough emphasis on the title to suggest that he questioned the legitimacy of Elena's position in the household. "I understand you've been involved in the children's education as well." Elena set down the coffee tray with movements that betrayed none of the tension Jake could see in the set of her shoulders. "I have been fortunate to participate in my children's learning, yes. They have made remarkable progress in both academic subjects and in understanding their cultural heritage." Agent Blackwood made a note on one of his forms, the scratch of his pen somehow ominous in the quiet room. Cultural heritage can be a complicated matter when it comes to preparing children for productive citizenship. The Bureau has found that excessive emphasis on tribal traditions often interferes with the acquisition of practical skills and American values. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jake felt his hands clench involuntarily at the casual dismissal of everything that made Tommy and Sarah who they were. Before he could respond, the sound of children's voices drifted in from the kitchen, where they were finishing their morning lessons with Martha's supervision. "Perhaps you'd like to meet Tommy and Sarah," Jake suggested, his voice carefully controlled. "They can demonstrate their progress better than any adult explanation." Agent Blackwood nodded and followed Jake toward the kitchen, his footsteps somehow managing to sound disapproving, even on the cheerful braided rugs that Elena had woven during the long winter evenings. What he found there was a scene that should have pleased any educator. Two children seated at a well-lit table, working through mathematics problems while Martha guided their efforts with the patience of someone who understood that learning required both challenge and encouragement. Tommy looked up as the adults entered, his dark eyes taking in Agent Blackwood's official bearing with the quick assessment that children learned when they'd had reason to evaluate adult intentions carefully. Sarah continued working on her arithmetic, her concentration unbroken by the presence of strangers, though Jake noticed the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested she was aware of being observed. "Tommy, Sarah," Jake said gently, "this is Agent Blackwood from the Indian Agency. He'd like to see some of your schoolwork." Tommy rose politely, his manners reflecting the combination of traditional respect for elders and frontier courtesy. That had become second nature to him. "Good morning, sir. Would you like to see our reading or our mathematics?" Agent Blackwood studied the boy with the intensity of someone looking for flaws in an otherwise acceptable facade. "What are you currently reading, young man?" Tommy moved to the bookshelf that Jake had installed in the kitchen corner, selecting a volume with the confidence of someone who genuinely enjoyed the worlds that books could open. "We are reading The Last of the Mohicans by Mr. Cooper. It is a story about people caught between different ways of life, which we find very interesting." The choice of book seemed to catch Agent Blackwood off guard, perhaps because it suggested a level of literary sophistication he hadn't expected, or perhaps because the subject matter hit uncomfortably close to the situation he was investigating. "And what do you think of this story?" Tommy considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all intellectual challenges. "I think Mr. Cooper understood that people can be loyal to their heritage while still adapting to new circumstances. The characters who survive are the ones who learn to honor the past while building a future that makes sense in their current world." Sarah looked up from her mathematics, her face bright with the enthusiasm she brought to any opportunity to share knowledge. "We also read in Shoshone," she added. "Our mother teaches us the old stories, and sometimes we translate them into English to see how the same truths can be expressed in different languages." Agent Blackwood made more notes, his expression unreadable as he processed information. That clearly didn't fit the categories he'd prepared for. "And what subjects are you studying besides reading?" The next hour passed in a detailed examination of the children's educational progress, From their mastery of arithmetic and geography, to their knowledge of American history and their ability to write clear, grammatically correct English, Agent Blackwood tested their penmanship, their spelling, their understanding of civics, and their familiarity with the Constitution. At every turn, Tommy and Sarah demonstrated not just competence, but genuine engagement with their studies, the kind of intellectual curiosity that couldn't be faked or coached. But Jake could see that their academic achievements weren't the real focus of Agent Blackwood's investigation. His questions gradually shifted toward matters of daily routine and cultural practice, probing for evidence that the children were being raised in ways that might undermine their assimilation into mainstream American society. "Do you attend church regularly?" he asked, his pen poised to record their answer. "Yes, sir," Tommy replied. "We go to services with our family every Sunday. Pastor Mills teaches us about Christian values and the importance of community service." "And do you participate in any tribal ceremonies or traditional practices?" This was the question Jake had been dreading, the one that could provide ammunition for anyone determined to find fault with their arrangement. Elena stepped forward slightly, her presence offering support to children who were being asked to defend the very foundations of their identity. "We honor our ancestors through stories and seasonal celebrations," Sarah said with quiet dignity. "Our mother teaches us that understanding where we come from helps us decide where we want to go." Agent Blackwood's pen scratched against his paper with increasing frequency, and Jake could sense the man building toward some kind of conclusion that would determine their family's future. The morning had revealed nothing but evidence of well-educated, well-adjusted children who were thriving under circumstances that should have been celebrated rather than investigated. But as Agent Blackwood closed his portfolio and prepared to deliver his preliminary assessment, Jake understood that facts and evidence might not be enough to protect the life they'd built together. Sometimes the power to destroy families came wrapped in official documents and bureaucratic authority, and the best intentions in the world couldn't always prevail against policies designed to achieve goals that had nothing to do with children's welfare. Part 7. Agent Blackwood spent 3 days at Copper Ridge Ranch, his presence casting a shadow over routines that had become as natural as breathing. He observed morning lessons and evening conversations, examined the children's bedrooms and the books on their shelves, interviewed Martha about her role in their daily care, and questioned Pastor Mills about their religious instruction. Every interaction felt like a test with stakes too high to contemplate. On the second day, he accompanied Tommy and Sarah to school in Pine Valley, where Annie Cooper had prepared her classroom with the nervous energy of someone whose teaching methods were about to be evaluated by someone who might not appreciate innovative approaches to education. Agent Blackwood sat in the back of the one-room schoolhouse, his note-taking a constant reminder that this was not a normal day for any of the students. Tommy and Sarah performed flawlessly, demonstrating their reading skills by taking turns with passages from McGuffey's Reader, solving arithmetic problems on the blackboard with confidence that came from genuine understanding and participating in geography lessons that revealed their knowledge extended far beyond the boundaries of Wind River Valley. Their classmates, children of farmers and ranchers who had learned to accept the Black Horse twins as simply another part of their community, seemed puzzled by the formal observation, but continued to interact with Tommy and Sarah with the casual friendship that had developed over months of shared learning. During the lunch break, Agent Blackwood questioned Annie Cooper with the thoroughness of someone conducting a criminal investigation rather than an educational assessment. "Miss Cooper, in your professional opinion, are these children receiving instruction appropriate to their future needs?" Annie Cooper had been teaching for 15 years and had developed strong opinions about what children needed to succeed in life. She faced Agent Blackwood with the fearless dignity of someone who had dedicated her life to nurturing young minds and refused to be intimidated by bureaucratic authority. "Agent Blackwood," she said firmly, "Tommy and Sarah Blackhorse are among The most capable students I have ever had the privilege to teach. They read at a level appropriate for children 2 years older. Their mathematical skills exceed territorial standards, and their curiosity about the world around them suggests they will continue learning throughout their lives. More importantly, they demonstrate the kind of character traits that make good citizens: kindness, responsibility, respect for others, and pride in honest work. Agent Blackwood made notes that seemed designed to find fault with even the most positive assessment. And do you believe their cultural background creates any obstacles to their integration with their peers? Annie Cooper's expression hardened slightly, her teacher's instincts recognizing the trap hidden in the question. Their cultural background is an asset, not an obstacle. They bring perspectives and knowledge that enrich our entire classroom. Their classmates have learned about different ways of understanding the natural world, different approaches to solving problems, and different traditions of respect for elders and community cooperation. If anything, Tommy and Sarah have made all of our children more well-rounded and open-minded. But Agent Blackwood's questions revealed that he was less interested in the children's academic success than in their compliance with government policies that viewed Native culture as something to be eradicated rather than celebrated. His real concern became clear during a private conversation with Elena on the evening of his second day, when he found her on the porch mending one of Tommy's shirts while the children played with wooden horses that Jake had carved during the previous winter. "Mrs. Morrison," he began, settling into the chair beside her with the careful movements of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news, "I must ask you about the extent to which you continue to expose these children to tribal influences." Elena's needle paused in its work, her dark eyes meeting his with the steady gaze of someone who had faced down more dangerous men than this bureaucrat with his forms and his prejudices. "Could you be more specific about what you mean by tribal influences?" Agent Blackwood consulted his notes with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this conversation since his arrival. "Reports suggest that you continue to speak to them in their native language, that you tell them stories about traditional tribal beliefs, and that you encourage them to maintain connections with family members on the reservation. The Bureau's position is that such practices interfere with the assimilation process and may prevent these children from fully embracing American citizenship." Elena set down her sewing with movements that betrayed none of the anger Jake could see building in her expression. "Agent Blackwood, my children speak English fluently, read and write at an advanced level, understand American history and government, and participate fully in this community's civic and religious life. They are also proud of their Shoshone heritage and maintain connections with family members who love them. I fail to see how any of this prevents them from being good Americans." "The problem," Agent Blackwood replied, his tone carrying the patience of someone explaining obvious truths to a slow student, "is that divided loyalties create confusion about identity and purpose. Children who are encouraged to maintain tribal connections often struggle to fully commit to American values and may even develop resentment toward the civilization that offers them opportunities for advancement." Elena's laugh was soft but carried an edge that made Agent Blackwood shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Agent Blackwood, have you considered that children who understand and appreciate multiple cultures might actually be better prepared for citizenship in a nation built by people from many different backgrounds?" The conversation continued in circles, with Agent Blackwood citing policies and procedures while Elena presented evidence of her children's success and integration. But Jake, listening from inside the house where he pretended to read his newspaper, could hear the fundamental disconnect between a man who viewed diversity as a problem to be solved and a woman who saw it as a strength to be celebrated. Crisis came on the morning of Agent Blackwood's third day, when he announced his preliminary findings to the assembled family in the ranch house parlor. Tommy and Sarah sat close together on the settee, their usual morning chatter replaced by the kind of alert silence that children adopted when they sensed that adult conversations might determine their fate. After careful observation and evaluation, Agent Blackwood began. Reading from a prepared statement that carried the weight of official judgment, I have concluded that while these children are receiving adequate academic instruction, their current living arrangement does not fully comply with federal guidelines regarding the proper education and assimilation of Native American youth. Elena's hand found Jake's, her fingers gripping his with the intensity of someone fighting to maintain composure in the face of devastating news. Martha stopped her dusting and moved closer to the children, her maternal instincts recognizing the need to provide comfort before it was explicitly requested. Specifically, Agent Blackwood continued, I have observed continued use of tribal language, ongoing exposure to traditional stories and beliefs, and maintenance of connections with reservation family members that may impede the complete cultural transformation that federal policy is designed to achieve. Tommy raised his hand with the polite attention that his teachers had taught him to use when he had questions about difficult subjects. Sir, may I ask what kind of cultural transformation you believe we need? Agent Blackwood looked surprised by the directness of the question, as if he hadn't expected to be challenged by someone whose future he was deciding. Young man, the goal of federal Indian policy is to help Native children become fully integrated into American society by leaving behind tribal customs that may prevent them from taking advantage of opportunities for education and employment. Sarah's voice was small but clear when she spoke. But we already have education, and we already know how to work and contribute to our community. Why would we need to forget where we came from in order to succeed where we are going? The question hung in the air with the kind of innocent logic that could expose the fundamental contradictions in even the most carefully constructed policies. Agent Blackwood cleared his throat and returned to his prepared statement, perhaps recognizing that engaging in philosophical debates with 8-year-old children was not likely to strengthen his position. My recommendation will be that Tommy and Sarah Blackhorse be enrolled in the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, where they can receive the kind of comprehensive education and cultural training that will prepare them for productive citizenship without the confusing influences of their current environment. The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock and dismay that seemed to touch every surface. Elena made a sound that might have been a gasp or a sob, while Jake felt his vision narrow to a single point of focus that contained nothing but rage at the casual cruelty of bureaucratic power. But it was Martha who spoke first, her voice carrying the kind of fury that came from someone whose protective instincts had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Over my dead body, she said quietly, but with the absolute conviction of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. These children belong here with their family, and no government inspector with his fancy forms is going to tear apart what love has built together. Agent Blackwood's expression hardened at this unexpected resistance from someone he had probably dismissed as merely household help. Mrs. Stevens, I understand your attachment to these children, but the decision is not yours to make. Federal law gives the Bureau of Indian Affairs authority over the welfare and education of Native American minors, regardless of current living arrangements. Jake stood slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled despite the violence he felt building in his chest. Agent Blackwood, these children are not just living in my house. They are my legally adopted children, with papers filed in territorial court and witnessed by community leaders. If you want to take them anywhere, you'll need to go through legal channels that involve more than your personal observations and recommendations. The confrontation that followed would be remembered in Pine Valley for years to come, not just because it represented a direct challenge to federal authority, but because it demonstrated what happened when a community decided that protecting its children mattered more than complying with unjust laws. Over the next several hours, a parade of visitors arrived at Copper Ridge Ranch to offer support and testimony about the Blackhorse children's welfare and progress. Pastor Mills came with church records documenting the family's regular attendance and the children's participation in religious education. Annie Cooper brought examples of Tommy and Sarah's schoolwork and written statements from parents who wanted their own children to achieve similar academic success. Sheriff Bob Clark arrived with legal documents that he had been researching. Since Agent Blackwood's arrival, papers that outlined the complex jurisdictional issues involved in challenging an adoption that had been completed according to territorial law. By evening, Agent Blackwood found himself facing not just one family's resistance to his recommendations, but an entire community's rejection of policies that would separate children from parents who loved them. The quiet investigation he had planned had become a public confrontation between federal authority and local autonomy, between abstract policies and human relationships, between the power to destroy families and the determination to protect them. As darkness fell over Wind River Valley, Jake Morrison stood on his porch with his wife and children beside him, surrounded by neighbors who had chosen to stand with them against forces that seemed as inevitable as winter storms. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since Agent Blackwood's arrival, Jake allowed himself to believe that love might be stronger than law, and that communities willing to fight for their children could sometimes prevail against bureaucratic power that mistook cruelty for policy. Part 8. The legal battle that followed Agent Blackwood's visit consumed the autumn months like a slow-burning fire, generating paperwork and court filings that seemed to multiply faster than anyone could process them. Jake found himself traveling to territorial courts and meeting with lawyers whose fees threatened to drain the ranch's carefully accumulated savings, while Alina worked tirelessly to document every aspect of the children's education and development that might serve as evidence in their favor. The case had attracted attention beyond Pine Valley, drawing support from unexpected quarters and opposition from predictable sources. Churches throughout the territory sent letters endorsing the family's approach to education and cultural preservation, while territorial legislators debated whether federal Indian policy should override local adoption proceedings. Newspaper editors wrote editorials arguing both sides of the question, some supporting family rights while others defending the government's authority to determine what was best for Native children. Tommy and Sarah, meanwhile, continued their daily routines with the resilience that had carried them through every previous upheaval in their young lives. They attended school, completed their lessons, helped with ranch work, and participated in family conversations about strategy and hope, and the possibility that justice might prevail over bureaucratic convenience. But Jake noticed changes in their behavior that suggested the stress of uncertainty was taking its toll. Sarah's nightmares had returned, and Tommy had begun asking questions about what would happen if they were forced to leave. "Jake, father," Tommy said one evening as they finished the daily chores, his voice carrying the careful control that children learned when they were trying not to burden adults with their fears. "If the government people make us go to that school in Pennsylvania, will you and Elena mother still be our parents?" Jake knelt beside the boy, meeting his eyes with the honesty that had always defined their relationship. "Tommy, no matter what happens, no matter where any of us end up, you and Sarah will always be our children. Love doesn't get canceled by distance or government decisions or anyone else's opinion about how families should be organized." Tommy nodded gravely, but his next question revealed the depth of his understanding about the forces arrayed against them. "Will we be allowed to write letters? Will we be able to remember our Shoshone names alongside our English names? Will we still be allowed to think about this place and these people as home?" The questions cut straight to the heart of what made Carlisle and similar institutions so terrifying to families like theirs. Jake had researched the school's policies and discovered a systematic approach to cultural erasure that went far beyond simple education. Children arrived with tribal names and left with English ones, spoke native languages and graduated speaking only English, entered with traditional stories, and emerged with only approved American narratives. The goal wasn't just assimilation but complete transformation. The creation of people who looked native but thought, spoke, and believed like their colonizers. "I don't know all the rules," Jake said honestly, "but I promise you this, whatever they try to take away from you, whatever they try to make you forget, you have the strength to hold on to what matters most." You are Tommy Blackhorse Morrison, son of Elena and Jake, brother to Sarah, member of this family and this community. No school, no matter how strict, can change those truths unless you let them. Elena had been listening from the kitchen doorway, and now she joined them with the kind of presence that could make difficult conversations feel manageable. "Your father is right," she said, settling onto the hay bale beside Tommy. "But I want you to understand something else. We are not giving up without a fight. There are people working very hard to make sure you and Sarah stay exactly where you belong." The legal team that had assembled to challenge Agent Blackwood's recommendations was unlike anything Pine Valley had ever seen. Pastor Mills had contacted church leaders throughout the region, building a coalition of religious organizations that opposed separating children from loving families on cultural grounds. Annie Cooper had reached out to educational reformers who argued that the one-size-fits-all approach of Indian boarding schools actually hindered rather than helped Native children's development. Sheriff Bob Clark had consulted with territorial judges who were beginning to question whether federal Indian policy violated constitutional principles of family rights and local jurisdiction. But perhaps the most important ally came from an unexpected source. Dr. Samuel Hayes, who had been treating patients on the reservation for nearly 20 years, had witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of family separation on Native communities. He arrived at Copper Ridge Ranch on a snowy November morning with medical records and psychological evaluations that documented what happened to children who were forcibly removed from their families and cultures. "Jake, Elena," Dr. Hayes said as he settled into Martha's kitchen with the weariness of someone who had seen too much suffering caused by well-intentioned policies. "I've brought evidence that might help your case, but I need to warn you that it makes for difficult reading." The files Dr. Hayes had compiled contained heartbreaking documentation of the human cost of cultural assimilation programs. Medical records showed elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide among children in boarding schools. Letters from students revealed the psychological trauma of being forbidden to speak their native languages or maintain connections with their families. Follow-up studies demonstrated that graduates often struggled to find their place in either white society or their tribal communities, caught between worlds they'd been forced to navigate without adequate preparation for either. The official policy assumes that cultural identity is something that can be surgically removed and replaced. Dr. Hayes explained, his professional demeanor unable to hide his anger at policies he'd watched destroy families for decades. But identity isn't a suit of clothes you can change when it becomes inconvenient. It's woven into the very fabric of who people are, and when you try to tear it out, you often damage the entire person. Elena studied the medical reports with the intensity of someone whose children's futures might depend on understanding every detail. "Have you testified in other cases like ours?" Dr. Hayes nodded grimly. "I've tried, but the courts have generally deferred to federal expertise, accepting the argument that short-term trauma is justified by long-term benefits. What makes your case different is the evidence that Tommy and Sarah are thriving under their current circumstances. It's hard to argue that children need to be rescued from a situation where they're already succeeding." The breakthrough came in late November, when Sheriff Bob Clark discovered a precedent that had been overlooked by everyone involved in the case. A territorial court in Montana had ruled the previous year that federal Indian policy could not override local adoption proceedings when those adoptions served the best interests of the children involved. The judge in that case had specifically noted that policies designed to help orphaned or abandoned children could not be applied to children who had loving, capable families willing to raise them. Jake read the Montana decision with growing excitement, recognizing language that could be applied directly to their situation. Elena, listen to this. The federal government's interest in Native education does not supersede the constitutional right of families to remain intact when those families can demonstrate their ability to provide appropriate care and instruction. Elena looked up from her own reading, hope beginning to replace the exhaustion that had settled over her features during months of legal uncertainty. Does this mean we have a real chance? It means we have legal ground to stand on, Jake replied. But we still need to prove that Tommy and Sarah are better off here than they would be at Carlisle. The hearing that would determine the families' fate was scheduled for the first week of December in the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne. Jake and Elena spent the intervening days preparing testimony that would demonstrate not just the children's academic and social progress, but their emotional well-being and cultural development under the current arrangement. Tommy and Sarah would be allowed to speak for themselves, a prospect that both excited and terrified Jake. At 8 years old, they would be asked to articulate their preferences about their own futures to a judge who might or might not understand the complexity of their situation. The night before they left for Cheyenne, Jake found both children in Sarah's room, working together on a project that they'd been keeping secret for weeks. "What are you two creating?" he asked, settling onto the edge of Sarah's bed to examine their work. Sarah held up a leather portfolio decorated with traditional Shoshone beadwork, but containing pages of English poetry, mathematical equations, and drawings that combined traditional Native designs with frontier landscapes. "We made this to show the judge," she explained. "Tommy wrote poems about what it feels like to belong to two worlds, and I illustrated them with pictures that show how both parts of our heritage can fit together." Tommy opened the portfolio to a page where his careful handwriting described their daily life at Copper Ridge Ranch. "We wanted him to understand that we are not confused about who we are," he said. "We are children who have been given the gift of understanding multiple ways of seeing the world, and that makes us stronger, not weaker." Jake felt his throat tighten as he read Tommy's words and studied Sarah's artwork, recognizing in their collaboration the very synthesis that federal policy claimed was impossible. These children had found a way to honor their Shoshone heritage while embracing their American opportunities, to maintain their tribal connections while contributing to their local community, to speak multiple languages while thinking clearly. In all of them. As he tucked them into bed that night, Jake realized that whatever happened in the courthouse tomorrow, Tommy and Sarah had already proved that the either-or thinking that drove government policy was fundamentally flawed. They were living examples of what was possible when children were allowed to build identities that drew from multiple sources of strength, when families were permitted to define themselves according to love rather than law, when communities chose inclusion over conformity. The next morning, as they loaded their belongings into the wagon for the journey to Cheyenne, Jake Morrison looked around at the ranch that had become home to a family that defied every conventional category. Elena stood beside him with the dignity of someone who had learned to fight for what mattered most, while Tommy and Sarah clutched their portfolio with the confidence of children who knew exactly who they were and where they belonged. The legal battle ahead would determine whether justice could prevail over policy, whether love could triumph over law, whether a family built by choice could survive challenges designed to destroy families built by blood. But whatever the outcome, Jake knew that the real victory had already been won in the daily life they'd created together, in the proof that different didn't mean deficient, and in the demonstration that the best families were often the ones that required the most courage to defend. Part 9. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was the imposing structure of red sandstone and territorial ambition, its high ceilings and formal furnishings designed to remind visitors that the law carried weight that could reshape lives with the authority of a written decision. Jake Morrison had never felt smaller than he did walking up those courthouse steps with his family beside him, their footsteps echoing in corridors where other families had come seeking justice and sometimes left with broken hearts. Judge Harrison. Whitfield was a man in his 60s whose weathered face suggested decades of frontier law practice before his appointment to the territorial bench. He had agreed to hear their case despite pressure from federal officials who argued that Indian policy was outside territorial jurisdiction, a decision that reflected either constitutional principle or political calculation, depending on who was doing the interpreting. The courtroom was packed with observers whose presence transformed what should have been a family matter into a public spectacle. Representatives from churches and schools sat beside federal agents and territorial officials, while newspaper reporters scribbled notes about a case that was being watched as far away as Washington, D.C. Elena held Tommy's hand while Jake kept his arm around Sarah's shoulders, their small family united against forces that seemed as vast and impersonal as winter storms. Agent Blackwood presented the government's case with the methodical precision of someone who had testified in similar proceedings many times before. He cited federal statutes and administrative regulations, presented evidence of the success of Indian boarding schools in producing graduates who contributed to American society, and argued that Tommy and Sarah's current situation, however well-intentioned, failed to serve the broader policy goals of Native assimilation and national unity. "Your Honor," Agent Blackwood said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone representing established authority, "the federal government has both the legal right and the moral obligation to ensure that Native children receive education that prepares them for full participation in American civilization. While the Morrison family may provide adequate academic instruction, they cannot offer the comprehensive cultural transformation that these children need to escape the limitations of their tribal background." Jake listened with growing anger to testimony that reduced his children to policy abstractions, statistics in a larger program designed to solve what bureaucrats called the Indian problem. Agent Blackwood spoke about Tommy and Sarah as if they were defective products that needed to be recalled and remanufactured according to government specifications, rather than children who were thriving under circumstances that honored both their heritage and their potential. The courtroom fell silent as David Fletcher approached the witness stand where Tommy and Sarah sat side by side, their small hands clasped together and their dark eyes reflecting the kind of composure that came from children who had learned to navigate adult complexities far beyond their years. Judge Whitfield leaned forward slightly, his weathered features softening as he prepared to hear testimony from the two people whose futures hung in the balance of legal arguments and policy interpretations. "Tommy," Fletcher began gently, "can you tell the court about your education at Copper Ridge Ranch?" Tommy straightened in his chair, his voice clear and confident as he began to speak. "Your Honor, I have learned to read books that tell stories about many different kinds of people and places. I can solve mathematics problems that help me understand how money works and how to measure land and calculate distances. I know about American history and the Constitution and why laws are important for protecting people's rights." He paused, glancing at his sister before continuing. "But I have also learned about my Shoshone ancestors who were brave and wise and who understood things about the natural world that can help make me a better person. My parents have taught me that being educated means learning from all the wisdom that is available to me, not just forgetting half of what I could know." Sarah nodded and added her own perspective with the artistic sensibility that had always defined her approach to understanding the world. "I can sew and cook and take care of a household, but I can also create patterns that tell stories about where my family comes from and where we are going. I speak English when I am at school or in town, and I speak Shoshone when I am with my mother or when we visit the reservation. Both languages help me think about different things in different ways." Judge Whitfield asked several questions about their daily routines, their relationships with other children in Pine Valley, and their understanding of what it meant to be both Shoshone and American. Tommy and Sarah answered with the thoughtful precision of children who had been raised to think critically about complex questions, their responses revealing not confusion about their identity, but a sophisticated understanding of how multiple cultural influences could strengthen rather than weaken their sense of self. "Tommy, Sarah," Judge Whitfield said finally, "you've heard the government's argument that you would benefit from attending a school designed specifically for Native children. How do you feel about that possibility?" Tommy exchanged another glance with his sister before responding with a diplomatic skill that had impressed every adult who had worked with him. "Your Honor, we understand that some children might need the kind of help that those schools provide. But we already have a good education, and we already have a family that loves us and teaches us important things. We would rather stay where we can continue learning and growing while also helping to take care of the people who have taken care of us." Sarah's addition was simple but devastating in its clarity. "We belong here. This is our home, and these are our people. Why would we want to go away from everyone who loves us to live with strangers who want us to become different than we are?" When the children finished their testimony, Fletcher called Elena to the stand. She moved with the quiet dignity that had impressed everyone who had worked with her over the past months, her traditional dress complemented by the confident bearing of someone who had learned to navigate multiple worlds without losing her sense of who she was. "Mrs. Morrison," Fletcher began, "can you describe your approach to educating Tommy and Sarah?" Elena's response demonstrated the careful thought she had given to questions of cultural preservation and educational advancement. "I believe that children need roots and wings," she said, her English carrying the careful precision of someone speaking in her second language, but thinking in concepts that transcended linguistic boundaries. Roots that connect them to the wisdom and traditions of their ancestors, and wings that allow them to fly as far as their talents and dreams can carry them. She explained how she and Jake had worked together to create an educational environment that honored both cultural traditions, how the children learned Shoshone stories that taught moral lessons while also reading American literature that broadened their understanding of different perspectives and possibilities. She described family meals where conversations flowed between languages, school assignments that drew on traditional knowledge to solve modern problems, and community involvement that demonstrated how cultural diversity could strengthen rather than weaken social bonds. The government argues that maintaining tribal connections will prevent Tommy and Sarah from becoming successful Americans, Fletcher said. "How do you respond to that concern?" Elena's smile carried the confidence of someone who had watched her children thrive under circumstances that bureaucrats claimed were impossible. "Your Honor, my children are already successful Americans. They contribute to their school and their community. They understand their rights and responsibilities as citizens, and they have the skills and knowledge they need to pursue any future they choose. The only thing that maintaining their Shoshone heritage has given them is additional strength, additional wisdom, and additional ways of understanding the world around them." Dr. Hayes followed Elena to the stand, presenting medical and psychological evidence about the effects of family separation on children's development. He testified about studies showing that children who maintained connections to their cultural heritage while also mastering mainstream academic skills demonstrated higher levels of emotional stability, academic achievement, and social adaptation than children who were forced to choose between their birth culture and their adopted environment. "The research is clear," Dr. Hayes explained to the court. "Children who are allowed to maintain pride in their heritage while also developing skills for success in the dominant culture show better outcomes across every measure we can assess. They have stronger sense of identity, better relationships with peers and adults, and greater resilience in the face of challenges." He presented specific evidence about Tommy and Sarah's development over the months they had lived at Copper Ridge Ranch, documenting improvements in physical health, emotional stability, academic achievement, and social integration that contradicted every assumption underlying federal boarding school policy. Annie Cooper's testimony focused on the educational progress the children had made under their current circumstances. She brought examples of their work, from complex mathematical problems to essays that demonstrated sophisticated thinking about literature and history. She described their interactions with other students, their leadership in classroom activities, and their enthusiasm for learning that went far beyond mere compliance with academic requirements. "Your Honor," Annie Cooper said with the authority of someone who had dedicated her life to helping children reach their potential, "in 15 years of teaching, I have never seen children more eager to learn or more successful at mastering challenging material. Tommy and Sarah don't just complete assignments. They ask questions that push me to think more deeply about the subjects I'm teaching. They bring perspectives to our classroom that enrich the education of every student." Pastor Mills testified about the family's integration into the religious and social life of Pine Valley, describing their regular attendance at church services, their participation in community activities, and the respect they had earned from neighbors who had initially been uncertain about accepting a mixed-race family with such an unconventional structure. "These children have become leaders in our youth programs," Pastor Mills explained. "They organize activities for younger children, they help with community service projects, and they demonstrate the kind of moral character that we hope to instill in all our young people. Their presence has made our entire congregation more thoughtful about questions of inclusion and tolerance." When Sheriff Bob Clark took the stand, his testimony carried the weight of law enforcement authority and personal observation. He described his interactions with the family during various community events and minor legal matters, painting a picture of children who were respectful, responsible, and well integrated into the social fabric of their community. "Your Honor, in my experience, problem families generate complaints and concerns from neighbors. The Morrison family generates nothing but positive comments from everyone who knows them. These children are assets to our community, not problems that need to be solved by sending them away to institutional care." But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Late in the afternoon, as shadows were lengthening across the courthouse floor, an elderly Shoshone woman entered the courtroom, supported by a wooden cane and accompanied by a young interpreter. Elena gasped when she saw her, rising from her seat with tears streaming down her face. "Grandmother," Elena whispered in Shoshone, moving toward the woman who had raised her after her own parents died in a reservation epidemic. Judge Whitfield called for a brief recess to allow the family reunion, but when court reconvened, the elderly woman insisted on being allowed to speak on behalf of her great-grandchildren. Through her interpreter, she told a story that brought a different perspective to the legal proceedings. "My name is Mary Elkwoman," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of government policies designed to help Native people by destroying Native culture. "I am the grandmother of Elena and the great-grandmother of Tommy and Sarah. I have come to tell you what I have learned about the difference between education that builds people up and education that tears them down." She spoke about children she had known who were sent to boarding schools and returned to the reservation as strangers to their own families, unable to communicate with their grandparents and ashamed of the traditions that had sustained their people for generations. She described the depression and alcoholism that often followed cultural displacement, the young people who felt they belonged nowhere because they had been taught to reject their heritage without being fully accepted into white society. "But Tommy and Sarah," she continued, her dark eyes bright with pride, "they come to visit me with stories about their life at the ranch, and they tell me these stories in beautiful Shoshone that shows they have not forgotten who they are. They also tell me about their school and their friends and their plans for the future. And I can see that they have learned to be successful in the white world without being ashamed of the Native world." She paused, leaning heavily on her cane. As she gathered strength for her most important point, Your Honor, I am an old woman who has seen many government programs that were supposed to help Indian children. Most of these programs help the government more than they help the children. But Tommy and Sarah don't need to be helped by having their family torn apart. They need to be helped by being allowed to grow up with people who love them enough to teach them how to be proud of all the parts of themselves. When Mary Elkwoman finished speaking, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of muffled sobs from spectators who had been moved by her testimony. Even Agent Blackwood seemed affected by her words, though he maintained his official composure as the proceedings continued. The final argument stretched into the evening, with Fletcher summarizing the evidence that Tommy and Sarah were thriving under their current circumstances and arguing that federal policy should serve children's best interests rather than abstract assimilation goals. Agent Blackwood responded with citations of federal law and administrative precedent, maintaining that individual success stories could not override established policies designed to serve broader national interests. Judge Whitfield recessed the court for deliberation, promising a decision within 48 hours. The Morrison family returned to their hotel room with the exhaustion that came from having their entire lives subjected to legal scrutiny and public debate. Tommy and Sarah seemed remarkably calm despite the circumstances, perhaps because they had learned early in life that they could survive uncertainty as long as they had each other and the adults who loved them. 2 days later, the courtroom was even more crowded as Judge Whitfield prepared to announce his decision. Jake held Elena's hand while Martha sat behind them with Tommy and Sarah, all of them united in their determination to face whatever came next as a family. Judge Whitfield's voice was steady as he began to read his decision, but Jake could hear the emotional weight behind his careful legal language. This case has required the court to balance federal authority against family rights, abstract policy, goals against individual circumstances, and competing visions of what constitutes appropriate education for Native American children. He reviewed the evidence that had been presented, acknowledging the government's legitimate interest in Native education while also recognizing the constitutional principles that protected family integrity and local autonomy. He cited the Montana precedent that Sheriff Clark had discovered, along with other cases that established limits on federal power when families could demonstrate their ability to provide appropriate care. The evidence presented to this court demonstrates conclusively that Tommy and Sarah Blackhorse Morrison are receiving education that meets or exceeds territorial standards, that they are well integrated into their community, and that they maintain pride in their cultural heritage while also developing skills for success in American society. The court can find no compelling reason to disrupt a family arrangement that serves these children's best interests. Jake felt his heart stop as Judge Whitfield continued. Furthermore, the testimony presented suggests that the government's one-size-fits-all approach to Native education may not serve the diverse needs of children who are already succeeding under alternative arrangements. The court notes that Tommy and Sarah demonstrate exactly the kind of cultural synthesis and academic achievement that federal policy claims to promote. Judge Whitfield looked directly at the children as he delivered his final ruling. Therefore, this court denies the federal government's petition to remove Tommy and Sarah Blackhorse Morrison from their current family situation. The adoption proceedings completed under territorial law remain valid and binding, and these children will continue to reside with their legal guardians at Copper Ridge Ranch. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, with Tommy and Sarah launching themselves into Jake and Elena's arms, while Martha wept openly and Pastor Mills led an impromptu prayer of thanksgiving. Even some of the government observers seemed relieved by a decision that prioritized children's welfare over bureaucratic convenience. Agent Blackwood left the courthouse without comment, though he filed an appeal that would eventually be denied by higher courts, increasingly skeptical of policies that separated families without clear evidence of abuse or neglect. The legal victory in Cheyenne became a precedent that helped other Native families challenge similar government interventions, gradually building momentum for policy reforms that would take decades to fully implement. 6 months later, as spring returned to Wind River Valley and the cottonwoods along the creek began to bud with new growth, the Morrison family had settled into routines that felt as natural as breathing. Tommy and Sarah continued their education with the enthusiasm of children who knew they were loved and supported, while Elena divided her time between teaching at the reservation school and managing the increasingly complex household that had grown to include extended family members who visited regularly. Jake often found himself standing on the porch in the evening, watching his children play in the yard while Elena worked on her traditional crafts and Martha prepared dinner with the satisfaction of someone who had helped save a family from forces that would have destroyed it. The legal battle had cost them money and emotional energy, but it had also strengthened bonds that had been forged in crisis and tested under pressure. Tommy was now reading books that challenged high school students, his curiosity about literature and history driving him to ask questions that sometimes stumped the adults around him. Sarah had begun teaching traditional beadwork to other girls in Pine Valley, sharing cultural knowledge while also learning new techniques from neighbors who appreciated her artistic gifts. Both children had grown into the kind of confident, capable young people who seemed destined to succeed at whatever they chose to pursue. One evening in late May, as the family gathered for dinner, Tommy made an announcement that captured everything they had fought to preserve and protect. "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I grow up," he said, his 13-year-old voice carrying the seriousness that had always characterized his approach to important questions. "And what have you decided?" Elena asked, setting down her serving spoon to give him her full attention. Tommy glanced around the table at the faces of the people who had become his anchor in the world. "I want to become a lawyer, like Mr. Fletcher, but I want to be a lawyer who helps Native families stay together and helps communities understand that different doesn't mean wrong. I want to make sure that what happened to us never happens to other children who have found families that love them." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "And I want to become a teacher like Miss Cooper, but I want to teach in places where children can learn about many different cultures. I want to help kids understand that they can be proud of where they come from while also preparing for where they want to go." Jake felt his throat tighten with pride and gratitude as he listened to these children, articulate dreams that had been shaped by their experiences, but not limited by them. They had taken the challenges they had faced and transformed them into purpose, using their own struggles to identify ways they could help others navigate similar difficulties. Elena reached across the table to take both children's hands, her eyes bright with tears of joy rather than sorrow. "You have both learned the most important lesson anyone can master," she said softly. "You have learned that the hardest experiences in life can become the foundation for the most meaningful work." As the summer progressed and Tommy and Sarah prepared for another year of school, Jake Morrison often reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. What had begun as a simple act of compassion during a blizzard had evolved into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about family, identity, and belonging. They had proved that love could transcend racial boundaries, that families could be built by choice rather than chance, and that children could thrive when they were allowed to honor all parts of their heritage. The ranch continued to prosper, but its success was measured in more than cattle and acres. It had become a place where different worlds could meet and learn from each other, where traditions could be preserved without preventing progress, where children could grow up understanding that strength came from inclusion rather than exclusion. On a warm August evening, as the family sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Jake thought about the letter that had arrived that morning from another rancher in Ozinemont, Colorado, whose adopted Native children were facing similar challenges from government officials. Elena had already begun planning a trip to offer support and testimony, while Tommy and Sarah had volunteered to write letters to the children explaining how they had survived their own legal battle. Next week, Alina said, her voice carrying the quiet determination that had sustained them through every crisis. We begin helping another family stay together. Jake nodded, understanding that their victory in Cheyenne had been just the beginning of a larger fight for justice and family rights. But as he looked around at the people who had become his world, he felt only gratitude for the blizzard that had brought them together and the courage they had found to defend what they had built. Tommy and Sarah had fallen asleep on the porch. Swing, curled together like the twins they had always been in spirit, if not in birth. Martha was humming softly as she worked on her knitting, while Alina planned lessons for the reservation school that would begin teaching children in both English and Shoshone as part of a new educational experiment that honored cultural preservation alongside academic achievement. The stars were beginning to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting in the snow and their last day in court, the same stars that would shine down on all the families they would help in the years to come. Jake Morrison had learned that some gifts came disguised as disasters, and that the best families were often the ones that required the most courage to defend. As he carried his sleeping children to their beds and kissed them goodnight, Jake whispered a prayer of thanksgiving for second chances, for love that transcended boundaries, and for the privilege of helping raise young people who would change the world by refusing to accept that different meant inferior. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with the same voice that had brought them together, promising that some stories have no ending because they become part of the larger narrative of hope, resilience, and the unshakable power of families built on love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.